So yeah.
All right.
Okay, welcome. Thanks for coming. My name is Adam Vargas, and I'm here with Bryan Skinker.
Heemskerk, yeah.
Skinker, yeah. He's the art director at Massive Damage,
Yeah.
which has made games like Halcyon Six, I don't know,
Yeah.
and Star Renegades, and
Yeah.
there's a new game coming out, if I'm not
Yes.
mistaken.
Farah, the Sundered Tribes. So you can see the teaser trailer and stuff. There'll be upcoming trailers coming for that soon. So you'll have the ability to see all of that.
So yeah, so check those out. And well, so can you tell us what do you do?
Yeah. Well, currently I'm the art director at Massive Damage. So I do all art direction. We have a team of 9 people. So there's two technical artists, a technical animator, 2 animators, a render tech, and yes, and 3 3D modelers
Yeah.
that work on one featured an environment, one does environment mixed with characters, and one does only characters.
So how do you balance having all of them doing the same project? Because usually when I have this sort of like, oh well, you should do this animation or you should do this kind of, I don't know, another character design, it usually generates very different types of products, right? So how do you manage to balance them?
Well, you have to try to, I mean, a game has to look cohesive. So in
Uh-huh.
order to make a game look cohesive, you have to rein it all in. People will have tendencies, and games have a threshold that works for it. And what I mean by that is, like, let's say you have a stylized game. If you go too far on this way, like too realistic, it's going to look out of place. If you go too poorly drawn or whatnot, it's going to look out of place. There's a range that it operates in. So when you give feedback, you're trying to push people into that range where it can exist in the game's visual structure. So that's typically what I do. I try to rein people in on one side, or I try to boost them up on the other. What kind of, if it's not looking good enough, I will have them shadow with someone that is known to create assets of a certain quality. Or if it's too realistic that it's not fitting with the tone of game, then you have to get them to rein that in to match the feel of what the visual intent is. So I'm mostly in charge of visual intent for what the game is, getting everything to coincide with that and make games work that way. When I worked on Star Renegades, I did all the art.
Yeah, yeah.
So
Pretty impressive.
other than particle animations and whatnot, and I would do all of the pixel art and assemble all, like, I would draw everything in the sprite boxes. I would draw effects in sprite boxes, but then we had one animator that would pull it and put it in timelines and engine. So that was the role, but I did all the backgrounds, characters, everything for that game. So I have a lot of experience kind of doing whatever a game's needed. And I didn't know pixel art right when I taught myself pixel art for Halcyon 6 and Star Renegades.
Wow. So
So,
okay.
but I went to art school. I did 4 years where I did with all traditional painting, drawing, everything. So I had a traditional skill set, and then I was always good. I love games. I've always loved games. I've always obsessed about them. So compressing how I think and function into how games are done. You'll hear some background noise. There's construction going on in my
Yeah,
house.
no problem, man.
Yeah, yeah.
So, man, that really shocked me because I know you through your pixel animations on Twitter. So,
Yeah.
yeah, okay. So, I want to know what inspires you or what keeps you inspired to keep on working to making like what 20 frames of animation? No, yeah, 20 frames per. Yeah, you know what I mean. What keeps you going, man?
Oh, for like drawing
Yeah.
stuff. I think for most artists it's always a mix, right? You need inputs, you need outputs, and you need to balance what you're trying to achieve. And what I mean by that, like, typically when artists come up to me and they say, "Hey, how do I get good at art?" I say it's 3 things. You need to copy things you love, you need to study from life, draw from life, work from life, and then you need to try to make your own stuff. And when you start, you're going to be better at copying, but you want ultimately to be the best at your own stuff. And for some artists, I tell them, get another sketchbook for it. Don't, if you're ashamed of the work where you're making it up yourself because you're much better at drawing from either life or you're much better at copying other people's work, right? Then you have a separate sketchbook for that. And then you have another sketchbook for drawing from life. And you want to keep doing it until the one where you're making up your own stuff is your best sketchbook, but it's not going to start that way. You have to work at it for a long period of time before you get good enough at that. In terms of what inspires me, I love games. I love art. I make art. I make games. And I can always get behind an idea that I can visualize. And I need personal outlets. So I don't have to make any of the art I do for Twitter. That's just when I want to feel inspired. And there's something that I like personally, and then I just take it, I have an idea, and I think about exactly how I'm going to break it down. Like if you, whatever, like some of the fun things are where art is like halfway between tech and art, and it's a challenge. Like how do you get a background to look three-dimensional in two dimensions, right? How would you animate it? How do you set it up? How do you scale it down, or how do you draw it so that you can keep scaling it down and cleaning it up to get it to work in that context? So I like those kind of technical challenges. I like seeing a product come to life, and I like actually laughing about a product that you make where you like, that was funny or that was great. I really felt inspired. I enjoyed that.
Man, that's pretty interesting. So you gave me like two different things that I can go off.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, first of all, you said that you have a background in traditional art, right? Something like
Yeah.
that. So, but how does it differ, like, let's say, normal art and video game art? So, what's the difference there? Or is there any
Limitations.
difference?
There's difference. Like the people that are best at video game art are best at working within limitations, right? So like even if you think of animation, if you're doing animation for cinema, right, you can just do your whole scene. You set up your scene, you animate this. You might have some restrictions in terms of performance, in terms of like you can't have 50 actors on screen, so you might have that in a pass afterwards. But you'll have all of the actors that are involved or whatnot. In games, it's all contained. You kind of have like one character as an asset. How are they going to live and whatnot? Then you have to combine their interactions with another interactions. So it's much more piece. And if you do it 2D, then you're contained by a box too, right? Like how big you make that sprite box in a two-dimensional game limits what you can do, right? So you're going to draw your particle effects differently. You're going to draw things because you have an actual physical limitation of space if you want it to take up a reasonable amount of memory. So it's art for games is with additional constraints at all points in the process. And I personally find that fun. I like seeing the walls of what they're cheating to make things work the way that they are, and then trying to work within walls to make people think that there aren't any. There's a beauty in running that running the line there between the two.
Yeah, I mean, I usually hear that, well, if you, as an artist, you have to be somewhat limited, right, to create the best art. Like, I've heard some stuff like that. So
Well,
hmm,
I'd only drawn pixel art. Well, sorry, I painted traditionally. I did all of that for years, and also digital like painting and whatnot. But when I did pixel art, I did pixel art exclusively for 3 years when I worked on Star Renegades and Halcyon 6, and I didn't do almost any other art. And I was worried I was going to be worse at regular art when I went back to it. But I was better, if anything. And I was much better, if anything, because I had to really simplify how I thought. And it made it easy to kind of filter between what's important and what's not when I went back to regular art. Whereas before I might have been a little bit more haphazard with values or haphazard with how I assemble things, and I stopped being like that. I was more direct and intentional because I had to work in such harsh limitations for so long. And you know, it's one of these things where people might like talk like pixel art's easy, but if you move an eye like one pixel over and down, it looks so wrong all of a
it
sudden,
looks
right? So
weird.
you can get really weird limitations. So having to work within that space and then limit yourself is kind of the fun and where it's at. And that's I think that's where I'm a little bit obscure, and I specialize a lot because I've had to work in a lot of different limitations. I've always obsessed with the technical aspect of games and how they're made. So that's just a personal me thing. And that's always useful because when you're looking behind the scenes, you'll know how to work with the limitations if you know what the limitations are and what the hardware is asking for.
Yeah. Okay, so talking about how you work, like, first of all, what software do you use to make your art?
I draw in Photoshop. If you're talking about pixel art, it's
Yeah.
Photoshop almost primarily. I animate in Photoshop too. I know Sprite and other things. I've used them,
Yeah.
but I am so fast at Photoshop even with its quirks. And I take advantage of its quirks. So I'm not going to proclaim it's the best program for it, but I'm
Mm.
so fast at it that I'd be slower to learn anything else at this point in time.
Yeah, I was expecting a sprite or something like that. Yeah,
No,
so
I just draw it right in Photoshop.
okay, that's very cool, man.
Yeah.
So also, are there some techniques that you can share with the world, like some secret sauce? I don't know that you have.
Well, this is the thing. Sometimes people ask me, it's like, oh, how do you get good at pixel art? I'm like, the pixel art is limitations applied on typical art, right? Like
Mm.
you don't you don't come into pixel art by understanding um pixel specific things. There's some rules, right, that you can follow to get good at pixel art specifically, but and most of it is, don't have even amounts of the same like color in a thing, right? Like if you do a bush, don't have it one third the highlight, one third the mid, and one third the dark part. What you want is you want it to be like 60% of one, 20 of one, and 10 of the other, and you'll get a much nicer bush if you're drawing with those values, because that's not the way light works. Like light hits a point and then it cascades. My face isn't currently a third lit in each value. Like most of my face, 60% of it is in shade, and then just this part is harsh highlight right now, right? So typically you either have overwhelming light where there's tons of light and then you have a little bit of shadow, or you have overwhelming shadow and a bit of light. So you don't want to even out your light. That's probably the biggest thing, but the rest of it is just understanding shape, form, lighting, proportions, perspective, like all of the typical art things, and you can't cheat those, right?
Hmm.
There's it's
Those
just
are fundamentals. Yeah.
translating the fundamentals into that space. So there's no hack really for people who don't already understand art. You have to understand them some way or another. You might be able to get around it for a little bit by working purely isometric or working completely top down, and then you can hide your weaknesses until you have to deal with them at some point or another. But I think most of the best artists, no matter what they're doing, whether it's pixel art or whatever, have a strong basis in those things.
Okay, so let's say someone with no background in any art or something. He can learn fundamentals, and then where do they go? Like, imagine I wanted to get to where you are, and I have no skill in anything. Like,
Mhm.
what should my like road be like?
It's basically exactly what I
Mm.
said before, is you need to split up your time between your inputs and your outputs, and you need to spend part of your time studying life, part of your time studying things that you like. And if it's pixel art, study pixel artists you like. If it's whatever, study work that you like, try to copy it to some extent, and then you need some of your time making your own work. How do you operate, right? And then you can see how you differ from when you're copying someone else and how you work natively, and you can compare between the two. The other thing you need to do is have windows of consumption and expression. And sometimes people mess up the ratios on this. So, whatever, you might play 3 games or watch 3 movies or whatnot. You need to have a window where you mix some of those things and play around with them visually in your head afterwards. If you're just consuming and you're not ever actually trying to make art yourself based on it, you're not going to internalize it the same way, and you're not going to process the content the same way. If you have windows of making your own work and windows of, of consuming other people's work, right, then you will consume it differently, because you're going to look at that stuff thinking about how you're going to make next. And it's about creating good habits of making your own stuff and consuming stuff. And if you're at 70, 80% consumption and only whatever 20%, 10% creation, it's not going to be that great. If you do 50, 60%, you're probably going to get better. And then when you watch something, you're like, oh, how did they do this? How did they do that? Oh, I could do this, like that. You get those questions that arise. But if you're in purely a consumption mindset, you won't even look at it for what it's done. It will, to some extent, ruin some media for you, because you won't be able to get into it the same way you used to.
Well, you're seeing
But
like how it's done. You're like with that analytical eye, I think.
yeah, it makes you look at things differently.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, would you say that retro video games inspired you, like Final Fantasy VI, like Chrono Trigger, like,
Yeah,
I
I'm
yeah.
inspired by all of it. Like I when people ask me my favorite game, that's a tough question for me. It's like pick a genre and then
Mm.
ask me my favorite game. Because how do I compare Fire Emblem to Mega Man? How do I compare Mega Man to Metroid? How do I compare Metroid to Final Fantasy VI or Chrono Trigger? They're different beasts. Some
Mm.
of them are my favorite JRPGs. I like classic, I like new stuff. I like classic stuff a little bit better personally, right? But I play new games. I loved Elden Ring. We've seen I did work for Elden Ring and Horizon, and I alternate between doing new in like a modern pixel art style versus doing old stuff and then kind of trying to make it look better than it did back in the day. And
Mm.
that's fun for me, right? Like having the balance between creating a visual language and then taking something and then compressing it into that visual language, or taking something under it and then bringing it up to that visual language. It's fun. It's fun to play around with that. And it's also like I feel like it's a bit lost because you see this with like this is just a me thing, and I apologize to anyone who hears this, but I don't love like the Final Fantasy pixel art remasters. I think they're
Oh,
worse pixel art than the originals.
I agree,
And
man. I agree. Yeah.
so that's my personal stance on it. It drives me a little crazy that they added too much gradation, and it's hard for me because Chrono Trigger, Final Fantasy VI, Secret of Mana, like those games, pixel artists have been studying their work for forever, right? Like the SNES to Super Nintendo to PlayStation 1 era of pixel art is always analyzed by people who like this specific field of art. So to kind of see them not understanding what they created themselves, especially when they're shipping something like Octopath, which does
Beautiful.
represent visually what they're trying to do. So it's weird because it's like, can't you just put the art director on Octopath to look at the remasters for 6 seconds and say no? Because that's all it would take. Someone with some visual sensibility that built up on what the visual language that they made, that they helped invent. Like Nintendo, Capcom, and Konami and Square, those companies specifically set like 80% of all of the template of how pixel art is and is communicated, right? And then some Western developers too, especially like on the adventure games things like, LucasArts uh,
Yeah.
and
Monkey Island, I think it's called.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
different, right? Because the West and the East had a different sensibility, right? You get outlines on everything that's Eastern, and you get no outlines on everything that's Western. And that's typically, there's specific design languages that they do either way, and there's, reasons for both. But
I mean, you should direct the pixel art remasters, man. I don't know. That would be great. That would be awesome.
well,
Uh,
just someone with sensibilities in that regard, because I don't think almost any pixel art, like anyone who's known or good at doing pixel art, looks at that and thinks it looks better than Final Fantasy VI. I think everyone who sees it is like, this looks worse than the original, and it drives me crazy. So, but anyone like without those sensibilities are probably like, it's fine. It looks good enough, and that's fine. They're allowed to enjoy it, but it has enough things that drive me a little crazy.
yeah. So now I'm going to ask you about something that I don't know. Well, I mean, I'm going to ask you. So you usually draw characters, right? But how do you fare with backgrounds? Like how are they different? Like are they harder for you? Like what's the deal with that?
I don't know if I typically, I mean, I do both.
Mm.
I'm sure you see, if you scroll through my Twitter, you see the Crying Titan. I did all the backgrounds in Star Renegades. So
Yeah, I
I
I
had to do,
what I looked in, man. They're beautiful. Like the maps.
I did all of the tile work, all of the backgrounds, everything in that game. And I used to avoid backgrounds.
Mm.
So I think that sometimes people are the worst. They're the worst at validating their own sensibilities to some regard, and you need to be pushed out of your comfort zones to a certain extent. And when I worked at other studios, like for a while prior, I worked on a bunch of games. I worked mobile, I worked whatever, and I would end up being on a lot of projects because I could match most people's art styles. So they would have a game and an art style, and then I would match the art style of them, and then I'd come in and I'd work on them, and sometimes it'd be 2 or 3 times faster than the artist that they had previously. But I'd match the art style and I'd put out the rest of the assets. But I tried to avoid backgrounds. So typically, what I used to do is the 3 jobs I had prior to working at Massive Damage. Anytime there was another artist, I would just give them all the background stuff if I could, and I would take all the character stuff that I could, and I did that for years. right? And I I just wanted to be character focused. But then when I started doing Star Renegades, I was the only artist, so I had to draw all of it. I drew all the backgrounds, and I got some of the the positive responses to all the backgrounds that I drew for that game. So, people like the character style, they like the animations and that, but there's these big backgrounds, right? That I did tons of for that game. I have a video reel that goes through all of them. I could probably pull up if you want.
Oh yeah,
But
that'd be great.
anyways, when I did all of that, people really responded to them. And I'm like, is this something I probably should have been avoiding? I don't know if I should have been avoiding it, right? Like I I wanted to because it was like my interest, but it wasn't necessarily because I was like it wasn't good for me. There was actually something in all my backgrounds that people were responding to, and maybe I don't. You shouldn't be avoiding the things you're avoiding. Like in art school, the first thing that a good teacher will tell you if you have trouble drawing hands is draw 100 hands.
Mm.
Draw 100 feet. If you suck at them, you're not going to suck anymore if you do it 100, 1,000 times, right? So doing things like that will help you. Yeah, this is the video. I could probably share screen. Oh,
Nope.
you disabled it, but
How do I enable it?
I don't know.
Oh man. Oh man.
That's
Oh.
okay.
Well, I mean, you can send it, and I will probably edit this out,
Splice
and
it in.
yeah, they'll know. They'll know what happens. So yeah.
Right. It's fun, right? Like you can communicate a story about a world in an environment, and you can communicate a lot about what a character's experiences are in terms of how you dress them up and whatnot. And I like to do both, right? I taught at college for the last 5 years, but when I was teaching them how to draw characters, I'd draw a character on the board, and then I'd put like one scar on them, and then I'd put like 50 scars on them. I'd be like, what's more interesting? And they'd be like, the one scar. It's like, yeah, it tells a specific story rather than this guy rolled through a bush or something, right? Like it's just a different story. Um, so yeah, I don't know if I particularly work in backgrounds. What I do now, I do kind of like a half mix between concept art and art direction, because I find sometimes trying to use words to communicate something visually is much harder than just communicating visually. Like it's easier to take a still of the game and paint over it. It's easier to just paint a background or a character or a monster to communicate what you don't agree with about how it's being built. And I think for me, it's always been a matter of doing whatever's most efficient. If it's most efficient to communicate it by drawing it, or if it's most efficient to communicate it by explaining it. There's place for both of those things. And I was going to say something about art. Anyways, I'll let you ask a
Yeah.
question. I'll come back to it if I do.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so you said that. Well, you've been in several different like stations, jobs. I don't know how to call them, but the one that impresses me the most is like you did all the art for Star Railers.
Renegades?
Star
Yeah.
Renegades, yeah. I mean, I have it here, man. I don't know where I forgot. So, but like, how did you manage that? How wasn't that stressful? Like, that seems like a lot of work.
It is a lot of work. And they had like insane animation quantities for it. So we went like there's giant robot bosses that had hundreds of frames for it. And we hit huge performance issues too on Switch and things because there were just so many frames. So you can still break a game with pixel art if you go too too high quantity in your frames. If you have like 30 texture atlases for one boss just packed with images of the same character in different slight variations and whatnot, that's hard on game engines. And then when we had that in Star Renegades, we had dynamic lighting on everything, and that also proved challenging. But I don't like art output. I know that I'm absurd. I know that I'm probably one of the fastest artists I personally know. And I don't say that as a point of pride. I've just worked in the industry long enough that I've worked with enough people to know that I am absurdly fast, and I just think differently than a lot of people do. So I enjoyed the challenge of it. I thought I could do it myself, and I did almost all the art myself, and it was fun, right? Like that was a fun challenge for me. Find out the style of the world, draw everything into it, and try to keep it all in a visual container that works. And it made sure that it all was pretty visually cohesive when it's all coming from the same hand, right? It's one of the problems with games as they got bigger. You get a game like, Final Fantasy VI or Chrono Trigger, and they're so cohesive because the team was so small and focused. And then as a game gets wider, right, it's harder. You lose the breadth of your vision increases, and you have to accept more on the margins of what doesn't fit in your game style as the size of the team increases. And a lot of games lose more of their personality as they get bigger. And then it's even more special when you find game developers that manage to keep that atmosphere and whatnot. Like I think Hidetaka Miyazaki, the Souls, Sekiro,
Mm-hmm.
Elden Ring, Bloodborne director, he's done an amazing job at keeping that team like narrowed and focused to the point where it visually looks and feels a certain way, in the way that Dark Souls 2 wasn't done by him, and you can tell. It feels less like his game than Sekiro does, even though the content is more similar to Souls 1 and Souls 3. It feels different because it doesn't have that same jamming into that visual space, that atmospheric space that his games have his signature of. And certain games, like we saw this immediately when Team Silent disbanded with Silent Hill. Silent Hill 1, 2, and 3, and 4 to some extent had a very cohesive mindset. And when then they opened that up to bigger teams and different people, it didn't have the oversight to narrow it into a tough enough focus to actually make that product feel like that.
Well, I mean, there's been a bit of a controversy, right? Like with the recent remake.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's going to be a lot of controversy around remakes, especially when it's done by different teams, right?
Yeah.
Because you can study the source material to death, but you can't study the environmental situation that created that, right? Like I always use this example for that, but Fire Emblem Awakening, I love that game, right? Fire Emblem Fates came after it, but they studied Fire Emblem Awakening. That was supposed to be the last Fire Emblem because Nintendo was going to cut their funding. They'd never sold enough copies, and everyone was freaking out about that. And then they pushed themselves, and they made something really special. Like there's something very special about how that game goes, in my opinion, right? And in Fates, they just copied and pasted systems that made sense in the world, in the loop, and then they gamified what worked in Awakening, but they just jammed it into Fates, and it didn't work in Fates, in my opinion. And you can have this where developers underestimate what the pressure the studio was in did to make that game special, and they over analyze the systems after they release the game, and then they think it's this or this and this about a system, but then oftentimes tuning that makes it worse, not better. And it's hard to find those balances in games in terms of your intent and what the setting does and what pressures do and what that does to the product.
And that's so interesting. I wanted to ask you, what is usually some of the hardest things that you do, like in your job, in general? Like, what's different? Like, well, I mean, you said you're pretty fast drawing. I don't know, like, tell me.
For me, I think it's a lot of context switching. Sometimes I have more than one game project I have to jump over to. Sometimes it's like managing versus production, right? Like where I have to go and talk to someone else or work over their work versus just drawing stuff myself. I think that it's mostly the context switching. I can exist in any of those spaces and I'm okay to exist in that space, but it's switching spaces constantly that makes it harder. So I think that's probably the hardest thing about it. I like getting good work out of artists, young up and coming artists. I like seeing people progress. I like making art myself. I like inspiring people by making art myself. Like these things I enjoy, and almost any part of a game, I feel like I could enjoy doing it. Sometimes you hit ruts, right? But what I always found was the number one way for me to stay productive is to have enough breadth of work, like different things that you could work on. So when I was working on Star Renegades, for instance, if I was really struggling on a character concept for an enemy or whatnot, and I just drew it and I didn't like it, then I would just do a bunch of character animations that were waiting for me. If I had a bunch of character animations that were really bothering me, then maybe I do a background. And I found that when I got blocked on one thing, I would switch to another thing. One thing I recommend to a lot of young up-and-coming people is start to game yourself. Learn how you learn how you function, and try to take advantage of and manipulate yourself to get the best results from you. And one of the ways that I usually tell people to do this is start everything when you get it, but don't finish it. So if you get an assignment or if you have a project that you're working on, start it the day you think of it. Start it the day and let your subconscious do the battling for you. Because
Mm.
if you work on it for a couple of hours when you first get it, and then you don't touch it for 2 weeks, you will come back to the table and you'll have thought of all of these things. You'll be like, oh, this, I could do this, I could do that. And when you go to do it 2 weeks later, you'll be like, I know exactly what to do. Your brain's refined it. You've slept and you've thought about it and you built on those ideas. But if you just wait the 2 weeks without having touched it first and then try to do it, you're like, I don't know what to do. Like you have to game yourself. You want to think about how you work and you want to take advantage of yourself and you want to prime your subconscious to do a lot of the processing for you. You're going to do a lot of thinking while you're sleeping, while you're resting, while you're doing something else on the back burner, but you need to have started it. If you don't touch it, you can't do that. So part of it is gaming yourself. I know, like, I have a story. I've probably told it too many times. I could probably grab a sketchbook and show it.
Mm. Yeah, yeah.
Uh, Gotta find the right sketchbook. This one. Yeah, it's this one. I have this thing that I do when I go to Game Developers Conference, GDC. So this is an example. So I usually draw the person speaking.
Mm.
So this is
Yoko Taro.
Yoko Taro. So when he gave a talk in GDC 2018, I drew him. You can see he signed it up the top there. So, and this is related to this for this reason, because I didn't learn how I learned until college or university. When I was in high school and elementary school, I had teachers tell me off all the time because I just drew. So I was misdiagnosed ADD when I was in grade 4 because I wouldn't pay attention to the teachers, but I would always be drawing during class. I'd draw, I'd do this and that. And they would want me to look at them, but I wouldn't look at the teacher. And it wasn't until college or university that I realized that if I studied for tests, I didn't retain anything and I wouldn't do amazing on the tests. But if I drew during all the lectures, when I never had to study, I could go to the exam or I could go to whatever and I would remember everything because I either rested the part of my mind that needed to rest so that the part of it could be subconscious, or I was creating visual cues for everything that they were saying and it could be the stupidest drawing, but it could be like, I'm on an exam and then it's, I'm like, oh yeah, that's when I was drawing that bear punching that guy. Right.
Mm.
And it's like, it's not related at all, but I have a visual association
create that connection.
when the teacher mentioned that because I remember drawing that when they talked about that. Whereas if I just read the material over and over again, I wouldn't retain any of it. So what happened with Yoko Taro is like, I drew him during the GDC talk, and it was him and Torin, one of the combat directors at Platinum Games. And they were after it. We went out into the hall. There was a huge line of people that wanted to meet him. And we went out into the hallway. And there was a line of like 100 people or more for photos with him. And I don't care about photos with people. It's not something that I personally want to look back at. So I don't take photos much personally. I draw and I like to live or process it in different ways. That's just me personally. But with Yoko Taro, he went through the huge line and he was wearing the stupid helmet thing the entire time.
Yeah.
Right? He's wearing the Emil helmet. So he wore that all the photos. And he takes it off when he's getting ready to sign the game copies and whatnot, because there's a line for signatures. And I waited in the photo line, but I switched out when they started the signature line. And then I was like third or fourth in the signature line. But he just went through like 100 photos. And it was like an hour and he was exhausted. He takes off the helmet and he's sweating like crazy. Like he's just gross and he's sweating. And he didn't talk to anybody, right? He just took a photo with them. They went on. Took a photo with them, went on. And then in the line after for the signatures, there was like someone cosplaying as 2B. And then there was this and that, which is actually more odd at GDC than it is at like whatever, an expo because GDC is more game developers, right? Whereas these other ones are more
for fans.
Fans, right? So anyways, there's a bunch of people lined up, like a few people in front of me. And then what happens is and he didn't talk to anybody. So he just like, hey, oh, nice to meet you. And then they went on. And then I put the drawing in front of him. And he's like, there's a translator. And he's like, did you draw this? I'm like, yeah. He's like, did you draw this while I was talking? And I'm like, yeah. And then he's like, did you listen to anything I had to say at all? And I'm like, oh my gosh. And then I'm explaining to Yoko Taro through the translator for like 5, 10 minutes. I'm like, I actually learn better if I draw while you're talking. It's how I focus. I'm like, I recognize this at university. When if I drew during exams or whatnot, I remembered everything. And I'm explaining this to Yoko Taro. And I was like the only person he talked to in line at all. And I thought that was kind of funny, right? Like you have moments like that where you wake someone up, right? They're in a process, they're doing this, and you can have a conversation or you can have something insightful that wakes them up. And then, you have visual memorabilia of it forever in your sketchbook. You got 2B sneaking behind him, right?
Yeah.
And that stuff's fun for me. I like thinking about how art is, how a game should look, right? And not also being so me-centric in it in a way. Like a game should look like what that game should look like. It shouldn't be look like what my style is and try to force it into it. I like to grow with each game. I like to be slightly underwater when I start a game and then gradually improve to the point where I have the game looking where I want. I love that. I love just like, and the mid development is like my favorite part in game development for that reason, because usually you get a couple assets that start singing and then you start to bring everything up to that standard in the game. And then afterwards you start to get bored with it and then they get slowly worse. And that's almost always what happens in game development. But it's interesting.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm rambling.
No, that's great. That's great. But we are running low on time because Zoom is about to finish the meeting. So, I mean, well, I guess there's no time for final words, but thank you, man. Thank you for accepting my interview.
No problem.
This will be shown at Universidad La Salle, Noroeste, Mexico.
Okay.
So yeah, that's it. Like, thank you.
No
Thank
problem.
you for
Why particularly did you choose me? Did you reach out to a couple other people or?
I reached out to other people. Well, I mean, just people that I like their work, and you were, well, I mean, you were the one that I wanted to be, like the one who I interviewed, but like, well, anyone could have been here, but like, I'm glad that it was you, man.
Okay, no problem.
So,
hopefully I learned something insightful. Take it from what I do, but I'm always excited to see upcoming artists and what they can manage.
Yeah. Like another question, like this is for like editing and stuff. Like, would you be fine if I put like some of your animations like on Twitter, like?
Yeah, go nuts. And I can pass you. It's all public now, anyways. But I'll pass you the link to all the Star Renegades backgrounds. So there's a video that I did that just kind of cycles more of them. So it's the in-game versions of them because I did 2D versions, fully 2D for Star Renegades, and then I did the 3D assembled versions of those 2D ones. And I had to try to keep all that. One of the things I tried to do stylistically is I don't like when pixels get smaller as they go further into the distance, so that I would draw it at a point and I would kind of billboard it up so that pixels almost always maintain the same size. You can't do it with the floor. The floor is going to do that no matter what, but you can do it with other things. And I really enjoyed personally like trying to make it work like that. So it was a fun visual challenge. But I'll pass you that and. Feel free if there's any particular images that you want, I can pass you a high-res version of them, and then you can like cycle the animations for it because it might make it easier for you.
Thank you. You'll pass it through Twitter, like here, Zoom, like.
I can send them wherever you want. If you email me what your requests are, I can kind of pass it through there. That's easier. I can make a little folder for you on Dropbox.
Yeah, I'm going to email you, man. But like.
Sorry?
I'm going to email you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like.
Yeah. Feel free. There's one other thing. Where you go? I can also post stuff that's public of our current game, so you can see some of the breadth of like digital painting and stuff that I've done as well, if you need that. But whatever you need, just message me about it.
Okay. Thank you, man.
No problem.
Yeah. Bye. Good luck with everything.
You too.